In 2001, a Dutch cardiologist named Pim van Lommel published a study in the Lancet, one of the most prestigious peer-reviewed medical journals in the world. The study tracked 344 cardiac arrest patients who were clinically dead. No heartbeat, no brain activity, no blood flow to the brain. Medically, these people were gone, and then they came back. 62 of them reported detailed, verifiable memories from the time they were dead. They described watching their own resuscitation from above. They reported conversations between nurses that were later confirmed. They described seeing objects placed on shelves, objects that were physically impossible to see from where their body lay. Van Lommel's conclusion was not that they had hallucinated. His conclusion, published in one of the world's most rigorous scientific journals, was that consciousness, somehow, continued to function outside of the body. That sentence alone should break your brain a little, because if consciousness is just the brain, a biological machine, then when the machine stops, the experience stops. That is the materialist model. That is the model every major institution in the Western world operates on. But the data doesn't cooperate. And here's the thing about data, it doesn't care about your worldview. You are not perceiving reality as it actually is, not even close. You see in 3 spatial dimensions plus time. You process electromagnetic radiation between roughly 380 and 700 nanometers. That's what humans call visible light. Outside that window? Infrared, ultraviolet, X-rays, gamma rays, radio waves, all completely invisible to you, all physically real, all constantly passing through your body right now. This is not mysticism. This is basic physics. The version of reality your senses construct is a very specific, very narrow slice of what's actually there. Now, let's go deeper. In 1995, physicist Edward Witten at the Institute for Advanced Study at Princeton, the same institution where Einstein spent his final years, presented M-theory, the theoretical framework that, right now, represents the most mathematically consistent description of reality we have. M-theory requires 11 dimensions, not 4. 11. The reason we don't experience the other 7, according to the theory, is that they are compactified, folded up at scales so small that they exist below the Planck length, approximately 1.6 times 10 to the minus 35 meters. A scale so small it's essentially incomprehensible. A proton is roughly 10 to the 20 times larger. Mainstream physics is telling you, with a straight face, that there are entire dimensions of reality folded into the fabric of space that you cannot access, cannot detect, and cannot perceive in any conventional way. Now here's the question. Nobody in a lab coat wants to ask out loud, what if something exists there? In 2023, NASA's official position on the composition of the universe was this: approximately 5% of the universe is observable matter, the kind you can see, touch, measure, and detect. The remaining 95% is classified as dark matter and dark energy. We know it's there because of gravitational effects. We know it interacts with normal matter. But every instrument we have built, every satellite we have launched, every particle collider we have run, none of them has directly detected dark matter or dark energy. It is, quite literally, an invisible force that shapes the structure of reality, which we cannot see, touch, or interact with directly. Again, not mythology. This is the official cosmological model used by NASA, ESA, and every major physics department on Earth. The universe, by the numbers, is 95% invisible. Now here's where this gets interesting. For millennia, the dominant description of heaven and hell across virtually every major religion and culture was not a physical location. It was a different realm, a different plane, a different level of existence that was adjacent to ours, but inaccessible by conventional means. The ancient Greek conception of Hades was not underground in a literal sense. It was a different state of being, separated from the living world by a metaphysical boundary, The Islamic conception of barzakh, the barrier between death and resurrection, is explicitly described as a dimension that exists but cannot be perceived by the living. The Hebrew term Sheol is not a coordinate, it is a state of existence. These weren't people who believed in fairy tales. These were people trying to describe something with the vocabulary they had. And the thing they were describing, across completely separate cultures with no contact with each other, sounded remarkably similar. A real place, inaccessible by physical means, where something of you continues after death. Here is the central problem with the materialist explanation of consciousness. Your brain is roughly 1.4 kilograms of biological tissue. It processes information electrochemically, and according to the dominant scientific model, every experience you have ever had, every emotion, every memory, every sensation of color or music or love is the result of electrochemical signals between neurons. That model has one catastrophic hole in it. Nobody can explain why it produces experience at all. This is what philosopher David Chalmers called the hard problem of consciousness in a landmark 1995 paper that the philosophy and neuroscience communities are still wrestling with today. The problem isn't explaining how the brain processes information. We have pretty good models for that. The problem is explaining why there is something it feels like to be you. Why isn't it all just processing in the dark with nobody home? Neurologist Antonio Damasio, cognitive scientist Daniel Dennett, and Nobel laureate Francis Crick all spent significant portions of their careers on this problem. None of them solved it. Dennett's best answer was essentially that experience is an illusion, which raises an obvious question: who is being fooled? In 2014, physicist Roger Penrose and anesthesiologist Stuart Hameroff published a review of their orchestrated objective reduction, OR theory, which proposes that consciousness is not produced by the brain. It is a fundamental property of the universe at the quantum scale, processed by the brain via quantum events in structures called microtubules inside neurons. The implication of OR, if it holds up, is profound. Consciousness is not a product of biology. Biology is a receiver for consciousness. The brain doesn't generate your experience any more than a radio generates the signal it's playing, which raises an obvious question: what happens to the signal when the radio breaks? Let's go back to the clinical data, because this is where things get hard to dismiss. Van Lommel's 2001 Lancet study was not an isolated case. In 2014, Dr. Sam Parnia of the NYU Langone Medical Center completed what became known as the AWARE study, a 4-year investigation across 15 hospitals in the US, UK, and Austria. AWARE specifically attempted to do what no NDE study had done before: place visual targets, objects and images, in locations only visible from an elevated position near the ceiling of resuscitation rooms. The goal was simple: if patients really were perceiving their resuscitation from a position outside their body, they should be able to describe those targets. One verified case emerged. A 57-year-old man described events during his resuscitation in accurate detail, including the appearance of equipment, the actions of staff, and the sound of a specific machine, all during a period when his brain was clinically non-functional. The AWARE study didn't prove heaven. It proved something arguably more disruptive: that perception was occurring without a functional brain. Parnia's own conclusion was careful and scientific. He wrote that the results suggest the need for further investigation, and that consciousness and awareness appeared to occur during a period of cardiac arrest when brain activity had flatlined. No heartbeat, no brain activity, consciousness operating independently. In 2023, a study published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences examined brain activity in dying patients. In several of them, the final minutes of death were preceded by a surge of gamma wave activity, the brain frequency most associated with conscious awareness and high-level perception, at levels that exceeded normal waking consciousness. The lead researcher, Dr. Borjigin, noted the findings were consistent with a potential role of the brain in generating heightened near-death experiences. But here's what that data doesn't answer. If the brain is shutting down, what is providing the input for that surge? What is there to be conscious of in a dying body that produces enhanced perception rather than diminished perception? The materialist model predicts you should experience nothing, less than nothing, a fade to black. The data keeps saying something different. In 1884, a Victorian schoolteacher named Edwin Abbott wrote a novella called Flatland. The premise was simple. Imagine a world of beings who exist only in two dimensions. They see lines. They live in a plane. When a three-dimensional sphere passes through their world, they perceive only a circle, a cross-section of something they have no framework to understand. This book became required reading in physics departments worldwide, not because it's fiction, but because it perfectly illustrates a real epistemological problem. A being of lower dimensionality cannot perceive, detect, or understand a being of higher dimensionality. The higher dimensional entity can interact with the lower dimensional world, leaving effects, cross-sections, evidence, but can never be fully seen by it. Now apply that to the physics. If extra dimensions are real, and the mathematics of M-theory, string theory, and loop quantum gravity all suggest they are, then a being that exists in 11 dimensions would be to us what the flatland sphere was to those two-dimensional inhabitants. Incomprehensible, invisible, and yet capable of leaving effects in our world that we observe without understanding their origin. Physicist Bernard Carr of Queen Mary University of London, a mainstream cosmologist who has no theological axe to grind, has written extensively on what he calls a multidimensional model of consciousness, proposing that different dimensions of space may serve as substrates for different types of consciousness. His 2014 paper, Hyperspatial Models of Matter and Mind, is not a religious text. It is a peer-reviewed academic proposal that higher dimensional spaces may be the substrate for what we clumsily call the soul. The idea is not crazy. The idea is, increasingly, where the evidence is pointing. Here's the framework that actually makes physical sense of the data. If the brain is a receiver, a biological apparatus that interfaces with consciousness rather than generating it, then consciousness itself must exist somewhere. Something must be generating the signal the brain receives. And if that something exists outside the body, outside the three-dimensional space we occupy, it would be, by definition, undetectable by physical instruments. You cannot detect it with an MRI. You cannot weigh it. You cannot photograph it. Not because it doesn't exist, but because the instruments we have built are designed to detect three-dimensional matter and energy. They are 3D tools. They are blind to anything operating outside that range. This is not a new idea dressed in new vocabulary. In quantum mechanics, there's a concept called quantum non-locality, the property of entangled particles to remain connected across any distance, instantaneously, without any physical signal passing between them. Einstein called it spooky action at a distance and spent years trying to disprove it. In 2022, John Clauser, Alain Aspect, and Anton Zeilinger won the Nobel Prize in Physics for definitively proving it is real. Information, and possibly consciousness, can exist and operate outside the conventional constraints of space and time. The Nobel Prize-winning physics of 2022 is compatible with the soul. Nobody in mainstream media ran that headline. Now apply dimensional thinking to what every tradition describes when it talks about the soul. It is described as invisible to ordinary senses. Check. It is described as non-physical but real. Check. It is described as capable of existing independently of the body. Check. It is described as capable of existing in a space that is adjacent to ours but not accessible from it. Check. Every single one of those properties is consistent with an object that exists in a dimension beyond the three we can detect. Forget clouds and halos. Forget fire and pitchforks. Those are visual metaphors produced by people who were trying to communicate something with no language to describe it. They did what humans always do. They reached for the nearest physical analogy. The actual structural description across religious traditions is more nuanced and more compatible with physics than people realize. Heaven, across traditions, is consistently described as a state of perfect order, wholeness, and proximity to the source of existence. It is not described primarily as a location. It is described as a condition of being, full coherence, complete information, the absence of fragmentation, corruption, or entropy. Hell consistently is described as the opposite: fragmentation, isolation, disorder, separation from coherence. The ancient Greek Hades was not a torture chamber. It was a gray, empty half-existence. The Jewish Sheol was a place of stillness and separation. Even the traditional Christian theological conception of hell, when you read the actual texts rather than the medieval paintings, is primarily about absence, specifically the absence of the animating presence, rather than active physical torture. In thermodynamic terms, maximum entropy versus minimum entropy, perfect disorder versus perfect order, complete information versus complete information loss. Physicist Stephen Hawking spent his career on black holes, which are regions of maximum information loss, points at which entropy overwhelms everything. The event horizon of a black hole has a structural analogy to what every tradition calls a point of no return, a boundary past which nothing, not even light, escapes. And on the other end, physicists like Max Tegmark at MIT have proposed the mathematical universe hypothesis, the idea that at its deepest level, reality is pure information, pure mathematical structure, perfect, complete, irreducible. That is a physicist's description of what a theologian calls the divine. Neither would be comfortable with that comparison, but the convergence is there, and it isn't nothing. This is the part where most people's eyes glaze over because they associate the word Trinity with denominational arguments and things that seem designed to confuse rather than illuminate. So forget the religious framing for a moment. Here is the actual structural claim: the source of reality, whatever you want to call it, exists simultaneously as a unified entity and as three distinct modes of operation, each of which is fully the whole thing, none of which cancels the others. The honest reaction to that is, that's incoherent. You can't be one and three simultaneously. Unless you're operating in dimensions we cannot perceive. Consider what happens when you take a three-dimensional object and project it into two dimensions. A cube becomes a hexagon or a square, depending on the angle. A sphere becomes a circle. The projection is real. It is the actual object. But it is a radically incomplete representation. The two-dimensional observer cannot reconstruct the original from the projection alone. A being that exists beyond our dimensional range, interacting with our reality at multiple dimensional intersections, would appear to us as multiple distinct entities, all equally real, all equally the whole thing. Because we can only see the cross-sections of something, we do not have the dimensionality to perceive whole. This is not a theological argument. This is what projection from higher dimensions actually does. Physicist Michio Kaku, in his 2021 book The God Equation, discusses higher dimensional unified theories and notes that what appears as multiple distinct phenomena at our level of reality may be aspects of a single unified structure at a higher dimensional level. He wasn't writing theology, he was describing physics, the concept of a unified source that presents as distinct modes of interaction depending on which dimensional interface it's operating through, is not a contradiction if the source exists in dimensions we cannot access. It is what you would expect to observe. The apparent incoherence of the Trinity is not evidence against it. It is exactly the incoherence you'd expect when a three-dimensional mind tries to describe an 11-dimensional entity. We cannot explain consciousness. We cannot explain the origin of the universe. We cannot detect 95% of the matter and energy that fills it. We cannot reconcile general relativity and quantum mechanics into a single framework despite a century of trying. And we cannot explain why the physical constants of the universe are fine-tuned to the exact values necessary for life to exist, a problem physicists call the fine-tuning problem, serious enough that Stephen Hawking and cosmologist Martin Rees both spent significant effort on it. The standard institutional response is, we will figure it out eventually, give us more time, give us bigger colliders, and that might be true. But there's another possibility that gets very little oxygen in mainstream discussion, that we haven't found certain answers because the answers are not accessible by the methods we are using, not because the answers don't exist, because our instruments, all of which are three-dimensional, are constitutionally incapable of detecting something that operates in more dimensions than they do. You cannot hear radio waves with a microphone, not because radio waves don't exist, because a microphone is the wrong kind of detector. The soul, if it is a dimensional object, is not detectable by a PET scanner, not because it's not real, because a PET scanner is the wrong kind of detector. This is a specific, testable prediction rather than an escape clause. A dimensional entity would leave effects in three-dimensional space without being directly detectable in three-dimensional space. And that is precisely the pattern we observe in NDE research, in anomalous consciousness studies, in quantum non-locality, and in the behavior of dark matter. Effects without detectable sources, information without a detectable carrier. The pattern is consistent. The pattern is repeating. The pattern is what you'd expect if something real was operating just outside the edge of what we can see. For 28 years, from 1979 to 2007, Princeton University ran the Princeton Engineering Anomalies Research Lab, known as PEAR. The lab was founded by Robert Jahn, the dean of Princeton's School of Engineering and Applied Science, not a fringe figure, the engineering dean of one of the world's top universities. The lab ran over a decade of controlled experiments testing whether human consciousness could influence physical systems, specifically random event generators that produce data based on quantum fluctuations. The results, across millions of trials, showed consistent, statistically significant deviations from chance that correlated with human intention. The effect was small, it was repeatable, it was published. The mainstream scientific community essentially ignored it, not because the methodology was sloppy, John's lab was meticulous, but because the conclusion was incompatible with the materialist model, and the materialist model is the water that institutional science swims in. In 2011, Cornell psychologist Darrell Bem published a peer-reviewed study in the Journal of Personality and Social Psychology, one of the field's most prestigious outlets, presenting evidence for what he called anomalous retroactive influences on cognition. The paper went through the same peer review process as any other study. It passed. It was published. The response from the scientific community was not to engage with the data. It was to question whether the journal should have published it at all. Several prominent researchers called for retraction of a study that had passed peer review on the grounds that its conclusions were impossible. That's not how science is supposed to work. Science is supposed to follow the data. When the data keeps pointing somewhere uncomfortable, the honest response is to keep looking, not to close the door. The Institute of Noetic Sciences, founded in 1973 by Apollo 14 astronaut Edgar Mitchell, who described a transformative experience of interconnectedness while returning from the moon, has spent 50 years conducting rigorous research on consciousness and the boundaries of mind. Their publications include peer-reviewed work on distant healing, remote perception, and consciousness-matter interaction. The evidence base for anomalous consciousness is real. It is not conclusive, but it is there, and it is consistent with a model in which consciousness is not confined to the body or to three-dimensional space. In 2003, cosmologist Martin Rees, Britain's astronomer royal, not a religious figure by any measure, published just 6 numbers in which he argued that the existence of a life-permitting universe depends on 6 physical constants being tuned to extraordinarily precise values. If the strong nuclear force were slightly weaker, atoms wouldn't form. If the cosmological constant, the energy density of empty space, were fractionally larger, the universe would have expanded too fast for gravity to pull matter together. If electromagnetism were slightly different, stars wouldn't burn long enough for planets to stabilize. The odds against a random universe landing on all 6 values in the right range are not just astronomical, they are mathematically absurd. Some estimates place the fine-tuning odds at something like 1 in 10 to the power of 123, a number so large it makes the total number of atoms in the visible universe look like a rounding error. The 3 most common responses from cosmologists are: 1. The multiverse. Infinite parallel universes with different constants. We just happen to be in the one that works. This is mathematically tidy and completely unverifiable. There is no evidence for other universes. There may never be. 2. We don't understand the physics well enough yet. Maybe the constants are linked in ways we can't currently see. Possible, speculative. 3. The constants are what they are because the universe was set up to permit consciousness. Option 3 is the one mainstream science treats as least serious, but from a pure probability standpoint, it is the most parsimonious explanation for the data we have. A universe that appears deliberately calibrated for conscious life, combined with evidence that consciousness operates outside the physical body, combined with evidence that extra dimensions exist, combined with millennia of consistent cross-cultural testimony about a non-physical reality adjacent to ours. At some point, the amount of coincidence required to maintain the materialist model starts to require more faith than the alternative. Consciousness is not produced by the brain. The brain is a filter, a dimensional interface that takes a signal originating in a higher dimensional substrate and compresses it into a form that can operate in 3-dimensional space. Aldous Huxley proposed something similar in 1954 in The Doors of Perception, using the metaphor of the brain as a reducing valve, cutting down the full spectrum of consciousness to the narrow band that's useful for biological survival. Huxley was working from intuition and direct experience. What he did not have was M-theory. He did not have quantum non-locality. He did not have Van Lommel's Lancet data or Gimo Borjigin's gamma wave findings. We do. The filter model of consciousness makes specific, testable predictions. It predicts that certain conditions, clinical death, deep meditative states, certain pharmacological states, would temporarily loosen or remove the filter, producing experiences that exceed normal waking consciousness in richness, coherence, and information density. And that is precisely what the data shows. NDE experiencers consistently report that the experience felt more real than ordinary waking life, not less, hyper-real, hyper-coherent. They report a sense of total understanding, overwhelming clarity, the complete absence of confusion. That is the exact opposite of what you'd expect from a hallucinating, dying brain. A hallucinating brain produces noise, fragmentation, confusion, partial images. What NDE experiencers describe sounds like the filter being removed. The soul in this model is not a ghost. It is the full signal, the consciousness that exists in a higher dimensional space and interfaces with three-dimensional reality through the biological machine of the body. When the body dies, the interface closes. The signal does not. Where it goes, or rather, where it has always been, is to the substrate it was operating in all along. The higher dimensional space that mainstream physics calls extra dimensions, that dark matter hints at, that quantum non-locality suggests is non-local and non-temporal. What every tradition, across every culture, in every era of human history, has called the other side. Here is the problem the dimensional model creates. If higher dimensional space is real, if the soul is a dimensional object, if heaven and hell are states in a substrate we cannot access, then you have a serious navigation problem. You are a three-dimensional being. You cannot perceive higher dimensions. You cannot voluntarily cross the boundary. You have no instruments that detect what's on the other side, no map of the terrain, and no guarantee that the transition goes well. Every ancient tradition recognized this problem. And every tradition's answer was the same structural thing. You need something that has already made the crossing, something that exists on both sides of the dimensional boundary simultaneously and can therefore function as a bridge. The Greeks called it a psychopomp, a guide between worlds. The Egyptians had Anubis, the Romans had Mercury. Every tradition had a version of this, a being that wasn't purely human and wasn't purely divine, that could operate in both spaces. But here is where the historical record gets specific in a way that makes most secular scholars uncomfortable. In first-century Judea, a man named Jesus of Nazareth made a claim that was unlike anything in the ancient world. Not that he was a teacher, not that he was a prophet, not that he had wisdom about the divine. He claimed to have come from the higher dimensional space and entered ours, voluntarily, with a specific purpose. That is not a religious claim in the conventional sense. That is a dimensional navigation claim. He wasn't offering moral advice, he was offering a route. Now, here's where you have to be intellectually honest about the historical record. The crucifixion of Jesus is one of the most well-attested events of the ancient world. The Roman historian Tacitus, writing around 116 CE, with no theological sympathy for Christianity, recorded it as historical fact in his annals. Josephus, the first-century Jewish historian working for the Roman court, referenced it. These are not friendly sources. These are hostile witnesses confirming the core event. What is more remarkable is what happened after. In 1 Corinthians 15, a letter from Paul dated by historians to approximately 53 to 54 CE, roughly 20 years after the crucifixion, Paul cites a creed that New Testament scholars date to within 2 to 5 years of the event itself. The creed states that Jesus appeared after death to Peter, then to the 12 apostles, then to more than 500 people at once, many of whom Paul notes were still alive at the time of writing. That is a first-century writer citing eyewitnesses within living memory of the event and inviting verification. Historian N.T. Wright, not an evangelist but a professor at Oxford and St. Andrews who has spent decades on the historical evidence, concluded in his 800-page academic study, The Resurrection of the Son of God, that the empty tomb and post-resurrection appearances are historical events that require explanation. His conclusion was that no alternative hypothesis, theft, hallucination, legend, mistaken identity, survives contact with the full evidence. The resurrection, he argues, is the most historically defensible explanation for the data. Now apply the dimensional model. If the soul is a dimensional object, if death is a phase transition into higher dimensional space, then a resurrection is exactly what it would look like if a higher dimensional being voluntarily entered three-dimensional space, underwent the phase transition of death, and then reversed it. Not because death was stronger than him, but because the higher dimensional space was his origin point. This is not a metaphor. This is the only scenario in which a resurrection makes physical sense. A being fully native to higher dimensional space, entering three-dimensional space through a biological interface, dying, which for a higher dimensional being means the three-dimensional interface closing, not the signal stopping, and then re-establishing the interface, appearing in a form that could be touched and seen, eating food, occupying physical space, but also appearing through locked doors, disappearing at will, and eventually departing in a way that the witnesses described as being taken upward, a dimensional exit rather than a physical one. That is what the accounts describe, and the accounts are, historically, more robust than people who haven't read them tend to assume. There's one more thing. In the NDE literature, Van Lommel's data, Sam Parnia's AWARE study, the hundreds of accounts collected by researchers like Kenneth Ring at the University of Connecticut, there is a recurring element that most secular researchers note and then move past as quickly as possible. A significant proportion of NDE experiencers do not report a generic light or an abstract sense of peace. They report an encounter with a specific presence, a being, one that they describe not in terms of power or terror, though those words come up, but primarily in terms of what can only be called total, overwhelming love. A love that carries information, that knows everything about you, that communicates without words. Howard Storm, a former professor of art and committed atheist, died in a Paris hospital in 1985 from a perforated duodenum. His NDE is one of the most detailed and academically discussed in the literature. Storm described an initial experience of darkness and hostility, consistent, structurally, with the maximum entropy state described across traditions, followed by an encounter with a being of light that he ultimately identified as Jesus. He resisted that identification. He was an atheist. The identification made no sense to him intellectually. He reported it anyway, because it was what the experience was. The researcher who perhaps took this data most seriously was Pim van Lommel himself. In his 2010 book Consciousness Beyond Life, Van Lommel, a cardiologist, not a theologian, noted that the being of light encountered in NDS is described with striking consistency across cultures, religions, and prior belief systems. Atheists encounter it, Muslims encounter it, Hindus encounter it, and a significant number, when pressed on identification, describe characteristics that align specifically with what the historical record attributes to Jesus, the simultaneous sense of complete knowledge and complete acceptance, judgment and love, indistinguishable. Van Lommel stopped short of a theological conclusion. That is appropriate for a scientist, but the data is there, and the data has a shape. The higher dimensional source of consciousness, the coherent endpoint that the dimensional model predicts exists, the signal from which all individual consciousness derives, is not described as a force or a field or an abstraction. It is described across thousands of independent accounts collected by medical researchers with no theological agenda as a person. Specifically, it is described in terms that match one historical figure more than any other. And that figure, unlike every other religious teacher in human history, did not say he was pointing the way. He said he was the way. A navigational claim, a dimensional claim, the claim of something that doesn't just know where the boundary is, but is the boundary. Here is the full picture. The universe has more dimensions than we can access. 95% of its content is invisible to our instruments. Quantum non-locality proves information operates outside space and time. The hard problem of consciousness remains unsolved because materialist models cannot explain why experience exists at all. Van Lommel's Lancet study documented 62 clinically dead patients with verifiable conscious experience during brain inactivity. Dying brains produce surges of enhanced awareness, not degraded noise. Physical constants are calibrated to a precision that bankrupts every probabilistic explanation, and thousands of clinically documented near-death accounts describe, independently, across cultures, across prior beliefs, a specific encounter with a personal presence of total knowledge and total love. Every single one of those data points is compatible with one framework: a higher dimensional source of consciousness, a being that exists at the level of maximum coherence, at the level Max Tegmark's physics calls pure information and pure mathematical structure, chose to enter our three-dimensional space. The entry point was a birth in first-century Judea. The exit point was a documented death and a historically anomalous return, and the purpose, stated explicitly, was to solve the navigation problem, to give three-dimensional beings, whose souls are higher dimensional objects temporarily filtered through biological hardware, a verified route back to the source. That is not a sermon. That is the summary of what the data, across physics and history and clinical medicine, is pointing at. The materialist model has had 200 years and unlimited institutional resources to explain consciousness, fine-tuning, quantum non-locality, and what 62 dead cardiac patients experienced. It has produced no answers. It has produced bigger machines and more sophisticated ways of saying it doesn't know. The framework that actually integrates all of it, the dimensions, the soul, the death data, the fine-tuning, the NDE encounters, is not a new framework. It is the oldest one. It just turns out that the physics, the neuroscience, and the history are a lot more compatible with it than anyone was told. You were handed a model of reality that keeps failing to explain reality, and somewhere along the way, the replacement was filed under religion and told to stay out of the serious conversation. The evidence is here. The pattern is consistent. You can follow it wherever it goes, or you can stop at the point where it becomes inconvenient. But the data has a destination, and the destination has a name.